Thank you very much. I'm finding out the hard way that speaking on Sunday morning at a conference like this, you pretty much have most of your thunder stolen by this time. So this is good news for you. I'll be able to take a lot of my material and just chuck it. But they are dovetailing nicely, because I think what we're doing, I was listening to Brian yesterday and thinking, what we're really having, this conference John has set up for us is really looking at the roots of the traditional movement in many ways. And what we just saw previous to my talk this morning is where it ended up, kind of where the ultimate end of this Enlightenment-sponsored revolution is, of course, the New World Order, the complete eradication of the kingship of Christ and what's left of Christendom. And so whereas Brian was talking about our fathers in the faith in England, this morning I'm going to touch a little bit about our forefathers in the traditional Catholic movement in the Vendée in France. And there's a natural sort of alliance between the traditional Catholics in the United States and in France to this day, for the obvious reason that there are not two revolutions, 1776 and 1789. If you study it carefully, of course, and I think most people in this room would agree, there was one revolution. The Enlightenment principle of self-rule was tested first in the United States, in the New World, I should say. And then it was exported to France. And this is not a conspiracy theory. You see Franklin and Jefferson, going back and forth, and Lafayette going back and forth, helping each other out. The man that I'm going to talk about this morning, Monsieur Charette, is in fact, he first appears in history as fighting with the colonists, with France, against England, against England. So his story starts in our country. And the resistance that he ends up leading in France is also something that we American Catholics therefore have a lot of affinity to, because we're fighting essentially the same Enlightenment spirit of the revolutions of 1776 and 1789. 89 obviously was much more bloody. They had to destroy the eldest daughter of the church, whereas in our country the revolution was really not so much even about England as it was about a revolution, a self-rule revolution against the old order, the old monarchical order of Europe. So like I say, I think we have a very strong connection to our French brothers through the roots of the traditional Catholic counter-revolution, which began in the Vendée, and even currently. I'll be leaving in a few weeks, and I think some in this room will be with me to walk the Charette pilgrimage again, from Paris to Charette. And on that pilgrimage, which is a 70-mile walk, 3 days, 2 nights, all the tricolor flags, the French flags, nearly all of them, will have the Sacré-Cœur emblazoned on the flag. As a matter of fact, we've done the same thing with the U.S. flag. Put the Sacred Heart of Jesus on the flag. And the reason they do this in France is because they are the sons and daughters of the Vendéans. They are the sons and daughters of the traditional Catholics who resisted against the French Revolution in 1789 and through 1790s. They don't celebrate Bastille Day in France. Many of them don't vote in France because the war goes on. The story of the Vendée has no ending, at least not yet. And much of the future, how this thing is going to play out, as we just heard before from Thomas's talk, it remains to be seen. But it started then, it started in our country, it started in France, it started in England, and it's now swept across the entire world, and we're dealing with it on a daily basis. But it's really important for a conference like this, in my opinion, to discuss the resistance, because the resistance to this so-called movement of the people, who were so inspired, or so oppressed, I should say, by the domineering Catholic Church and the monarchical rule and so forth, that they rose up en masse, against these terrible kings and queens and the Catholic Church and popery and so forth. Well, even a cursory study of the French Revolution tells us this certainly is not true. But the image, the lie, must be preserved, and so things like the Vendée uprising have been nearly completely covered up. It would be on the order of, in the United States, if none of our own children or none of us had ever learned about the Civil War. It's that the resistance in Western France in 1790s is that of that magnitude, where you had 300,000 to 1 million, perhaps more, Catholics exterminated by this revolution of toleration, this Enlightenment's tolerant minions who want us to believe that they were tolerant, but of course they weren't tolerant in the least. And it's the same group, the same spirit now that we deal with. Those of you who are homeschoolers understand this. Those of you who are in the pro-life movement understand this. Toleration? Of course not. Our opinions, our views are being tolerated less and less and less. And we see this right from the beginning.
of this revolution in France especially. And it's important to remember that. But there is a growing awareness of an ability to move this message, and that's why this conference is very important. What we heard from Brian was very important too, with respect to understanding more about the resistance of the Catholics in England. And now it's happening, thanks be to God, with respect to the Catholics in France. So the last time, so this is kind of a cute story, the last time I went to the Vendée, I took 45 Americans in on pilgrimage. We actually make pilgrimages to these places. And whereas the years before when we had gone, no one was even sure where we were going. Travel agents would say, the what? The Von what? What is, where do you get crazy? There's nothing there. Swamps and, a little obscure river. But now when we arrived, we were met by, or I was contacted by a Vendéan, an actual live Vendéan, a son, a great-great-great-great-grandson of a Vendéan, who said he would like to meet us when our American tour bus came into Saint-Andoré in the Vendée. And I thought, well, that's nice. He wants to have lunch or whatever it was. And so we at the agreed to time, we met, and there was no one there. We're in the square outside the cathedral, no one there. It's empty. And all of a sudden we hear this kind of this little drum beat going, and we look and we see a little procession coming towards us. And there's a little group of people, Catholics, wearing the Sacré-Cœur, the rosary. They're looking like Vendéans. They've got their banner of the Vendée. They've got a music playing, and they had this little presentation that they were working on to welcome these American pilgrims that were coming all the way across the sea to learn more and to spread the word about the Vendée. And they're doing so very successfully. So this was just an idea of how things have changed. You have Reynal Sachet, whose book on the Vendée is now available on Amazon.com, and his whole effort is to convince the European Union to recognize the Vendée, what happened in the Vendée, as a genocide, to have it categorized as an actual genocide. So there is great news with respect to raising awareness. You've all probably heard of Jim Morlino and Novice Pictures, which has now made a movie about the Vendée. And when I saw that, it just was so inspiring to think of a whole new generation of young American Catholics that are now aware of what happened, of the great sacrifice and the great martyrdom of these Catholic forefathers of ours. So, good things are happening. And the French, of course, are very excited about Mr. Morlino's film. They've already made contact with him, and they're trying to get it translated into French. And so there are a lot of really good things that are happening. So I'm going to try to do a favor here to John, because I know we're on a tight schedule. In order to understand the fights, the war in the Vendée, you have to understand the French Revolution. So I'm going to skip much of that in this talk. I think most in this room probably understand the French Revolution. If you don't, and I hate commercials as much as you do, but this is a new book that we just published. It's by Arnaud de Lassus, and it's all about Freemasonry's attack on the Catholic Church in France, on the eldest daughter of the church. It's available for $15 back there. I'll just leave that as the infomercial. We can save a little time today if you want to catch up on the French Revolution, please purchase this book. Plus, I don't want to carry them on the airplane going home, so you'd be doing me a great favor. So why Charette, and who is Charette? Francois Charette is the leader. He's called the king of the Vendée. And the reason I chose him is because I think, well, maybe because he's not a saint. He's a regular man. He's a good man, but he's got his problems, his weaknesses, his proclivities, and he has to be dragged into the fight, into the counter-revolution in France, much like many of us are. We want to be left alone. We want to raise our children. We want to be with our wives and families. We don't really want to be freedom fighters out in the street or whatever. And he had the same sort of inclination. He had fought with the revolution, but when he came back to France, it's right in the middle of the terror, and his job was to defend Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI from the Parisian attack at Tuileries. So he feet first right into the bloodiest, the ugliest side of the revolution. And so he becomes this eyewitness for us of what the revolution was all about. But also, the other reason I chose him is because, as we just saw in the previous lecture, he came to a point in his life as a patriotic Frenchman where he had to make a decision between patriotism, love of country, and love of government, or following the rules and dictates of government. And that's where we all are right now. We're looking right now at an election that really is marked by its absurdity coming up, a presidential election between Barack Obama and Willard Mitt Romney. At some point, we're going to be either pushed out, as Obama's trying to do right now with his mandate, with the contraception mandate. Catholics will either be sort of pushed out of the discussion, or we may have conscience qualms ourselves and will remove ourselves from the system. And Charette has the same battle, interior battle with in his own situation, what to do. And we are going to ask ourselves, I think, over the next year especially, or a few months, how long do we participate in this sham? If we think we can vote ourselves out of this, we're deeply deceived. This is it. This is the final hour, and we have to make up our minds. Are we going to go along and simply, continue to vote, get out the vote, and that's going to be the Catholic thing? Is the Catholic thing for us going to be religious freedom? Is that all we want? Did Christ come and say that we should go out and baptize all nations, or convert all nations, baptizing them in the name of religious freedom? No, so we have to have the discussion that the Vendéens had, and that is that at some point we're out of this, and we're going to have to actually stand up and resist. And if you study the story of the Vendéens, or the stories of the Cristeros, or anyone who ever resisted this maniacal New World Order that's in nascent stage here and it's now coming about in our own times, anyone who's ever resisted it is either completely bought off, sold off, loses their souls, or they're exterminated. One way or another, they're taken out. The revolution doesn't care, either to seduce us or to take us out. They will come after us, and that's not, to be conspiratorial. That's what's going to happen. That's what happened to Father Michael Pro. He didn't want to die. St. Thomas More didn't want to die. He said, this is not the stuff of which martyrs are made. So all these great saints and heroes that we look at, Charette being one of them, were not heroes all along. But at some point, they faced the decisions that we're facing right now, and they chose, I think, accurately. So I think it's very important to study not only the saints of these periods, but also the quote-unquote regular guys, which is what Charette is, a regular man who sees this ugly face of revolution in the Vendée. So I'm going to briefly, because maybe somebody can give me one. We have about 15 minutes. I don't want to go over John's time here. So briefly, I'll just talk something about this Catholic counter-revolution in France. And just point by point here, I really encourage you to read Michael Davies' book, For Altar and Throne, The Rising in the Vendée. If you haven't, to get more information on this, we really want to spread the word. We want to support things like Jim Morlino's film, get the word out so people understand what may be required of us by studying what our forefathers did in the same fight and against the same enemy. One thing that's important to understand about Charette is, in all the Vendéens, is that what's said now is that these were a bunch of peasants who were dominated by their priests. The priests really were the instigators. Again, they did the same thing in the Cristeros. They always come up with the same line. It's not true. Of course, these were noble peasants who understood that their way of life was being attacked, but more importantly, their king was being attacked, their God was being attacked. Oh, thank you very much. Do you have any water? Or a beer?
You have another 45 minutes.
Oh, good.
Don't put it here.
Okay. Oh, that's good news. I got 45 minutes. Let's chat, shall we? There we go. Okay, so Reynald Séché, who's the man I mentioned moments ago, is trying to get this whole idea of the Vendée to be categorized in the EU as a genocide. Lots of luck, considering the EU. But he makes this vital point that the people of the Vendée were prepared for change. Taxation was high. The usual thing was they were complaining about, like everyone else did. And the fact that Louis XVI had involved himself in the American Revolution meant that there were problems financially in Paris and so forth. And the Vendéens were saying, what are we doing over in these wars anyway? Kind of like what's happening today. Thank you so much. And so they were open to the revolution at first, as they understood it. They, of course, didn't understand the influence of Freemasonry and so forth, but they were open to the idea of change. But then the central government comes in and imposes its organization upon them. Patriotic contributions to the revolution include much higher taxes than they were imposed. Conscription, they started taking their sons and putting them to war in various campaigns and causes in and outside of France. Police powers from the outside were increased against the Vendéens. And most importantly, the central government made the Catholic Church a state-run organization, banning the priests who would not join the new church, forbidding them to offer Mass in public, and finally arresting them, torturing them, and murdering them. Catholic nuns, priests, even bishops in the Vendée. And you'll come across the term quite often, juring priests versus non-juring priests. That simply means juring priests were the priests that would take the oath of fidelity to the new Constitution, the Republican Constitution, and the non-juring priests were the ones who would not. the very traditional Catholic priests, in other words. And so they were persecuted endlessly, and they were rounded up, and they were killed, and they were hounded, and they offered their sacraments in the middle of the night, baptism, marriages in the middle of the night, in obscure places in the hamlets and in the ridges and forests of the Vendée. So this is going on almost right from the start. And when Paris realizes that they have these priests who are not signing the oath, they begin sending down juring priests with guards, at gunpoint pretty much. And there's all these great stories in the Vendée about how they were treated. When they would arrive in the churches of the Vendée, young people would sneak in and steal their candles or steal their chalices, steal their vestments, just constantly, like little poltergeists, making it impossible for these priests to celebrate Mass and the sacraments. There's even a story about one who came in, and as he approached his new church, a Vendéan woman comes in behind him with a rag and a bucket of water and is wiping the floor behind him, cleaning his dirty footprints off of the floor of her church. They were so loathed. Pius VI excommunicates them and says that essentially they're heretics, they're schismatics. And when that happened, when from Rome itself the juring priests were condemned, that was the end. And they had a very rough road to hoe after that. But still, as this is happening, there's this escalation, almost a good bit like the Civil War in our country, where the North kind of comes down and the South puts up a surprising fight. And it's the same in the Vendée. They put up much more of a fight than Paris ever expected. And so there's this escalation of what they're doing militarily, until finally they're sending elite troops now down into this tiny little place in western France to try to make sure the whole world knew that all of France was united in this great and glorious revolution. I'll just kind of push ahead here on some of these military facts, which are interesting, but I don't think we really have time. Okay, so as this happens then, you have Saint-Just finally admitting what this is all about when he says, this republic consists of the extermination of everything that opposes it. There's your valiant champions of toleration. And so as the Vendéans achieve these victories, things get worse and worse until finally Paris realizes they have to go down and exterminate them literally. It's no longer a war. It won't be fair engagement. The rules of war will be completely ignored. It's going to be a bloodbath in which 300,000 women, children, priests, and nuns are exterminated. By 1794, 850 priests had been arrested and about 600 of those killed. 200 of them were kept in prisons. 850 Catholic priests. So priests today, when we're looking at what's happening with Obama and what's happening in our own country, have to realize that obviously this is what they face. This could be happening in a few weeks, in a few months, where priests who refuse to marry homosexual couples are going to be facing the same thing. And we have to look at what happened to these priests, to these martyrs, in the past in order to know how we're going to deal with it in the future. Do we sign and do we vote for marriage amendments and things like that? All these questions that are coming up. How long do we go along with the system? And what are we going to do ultimately when we have to actually take much more dramatic steps in opposing them? This is what the Vendéans were dealing with. And much worse, because after they refused to surrender, this tenacious heart, and remember, 100 years earlier, who was it, St. Louis de Montfort, had planted the faith so deeply in this region that now you have 1 million Catholics that are more than willing, still, 100 years later, to use their own blood to water the faith in this area. And this is what the revolution can't fathom. And if you think about the positive lessons that we can learn from the Vendée, we have the same faith. If we can keep the faith, just like the Vendéans never actually lost, we will never lose. So there's great hope in this idea. It's such a simple thing. Keeping the faith, keeping the traditions, homeschooling our children, going to the traditional Latin Mass, restoring our Catholic identity. That's what worked here. That's what worked in England, and it will work in our own country if we can get ourselves to realize that that's what's required. And again, it took some time. In the Vendée, it took terrible things, like the so-called drowning at Nantes, when they had the Republicans had come down and put so many Catholics in jail and prisons that they couldn't even lie down in some of the cells. They were so packed in. And so the solution was we have to literally start executing mass executions. And so they had things like the drowning at Nantes. Terrible stories, really, and I'm not going to go into all the details, but to give you an idea of the sadism, I mean, they would take a husband and wife and tie them to one log, tie them together with their arms around this log, throw the log into the river, and then watch, this was their entertainment, watch as the husband, while trying to save himself, would, of course, drown his wife, put his wife under the water. And then in trying to save her, he would be, killing himself. And this was great fun to watch which of the husband or the wife was going to, save his own life and kill the spouse. That sort of sadism is going on. Killing and murdering, slaughtering priests, raping nuns, all of the usual things. But things that even are over the top by those standards were going on at this point. There's a man named Jean-Baptiste Carrier who enjoyed killing priests, and he writes, never have I had so much amusement as in seeing the last grimaces of priests as they die. And this is the man that's responsible for the drowning at nuns and so forth. And I was in Paris some time ago and happened to notice on the Arch of Triumph, there is a name carved in honor and nobility, Jacques Carrier. It's still honored in post-revolutionary France, and yet this is the man who enjoyed killing priests and slaughtering, Catholics in the Vendée. It's just, it's unbelievable. So you have, and as this is going on, these slaughters, and they had the usual things like the shooting at Angers, where they would bring a whole, field full of Catholics, have them dig their own grave, and sort of Nazi Soviet style would shoot them all, they'd all fall in and be buried, whether they were, dead or alive. That sort of thing was going on. But the Vendéens, again, are so inspired by the saints and by the strong faith, the faith that, again, Louis de Montfort had planted so deeply. And there are so many great stories, Carmelite nuns kissing the scaffolding as they're dying, singing, the Te Deums as they're getting ready to be executed. There's Blessed Noel Pinot, for example, who's beatified by Pius the 11th. And of course, he's a non-juring priest. He gets betrayed by one of his members, one of his congregation members. And they use as evidence that he's a priest his vestments. And they bring the vestments into the court. The prosecutor says, "Oh, priest, would you like to die in these popish vestments of yours?" And he said, "It would be my great honor." And they actually they thought it was going to be funny. They let him put the vestments on as he was being executed. But it turned out to their disadvantage, because as this beautiful priest with smiling eyes and just ready to go to God, approaches the scaffolding, he's heard by all, "Intro ibo ad altare Dei," as he walks up the scaffolding. Completely backfires, and it's just an inspiration that people are screaming, "We will die for this, we will die for this priest, we'll die for this faith." It backfires again and again and again. So finally, after this just continues to happen, Paris instigates the so-called infernal columns, which is under the order to burn all that can be burned and to bayonet every human being that you encounter. That's finally, they're so furious. They're furious at the faith, obviously, more than anything else, that these little peasants can cause them such international embarrassment by continuing this fight, led, of course, by Charette. So they send 6 divisions, each divided into 2 columns, and they're assigned to kill everything, crops, livestock, women, babies, it didn't matter, just wipe it out. And they did this for weeks on end, literally scorched earth policy, destroying everything. And all the usual stories there about babies being bayoneted and pregnant women going through every imaginable abomination are recorded. I'm not going to go into those. The important thing is that even this failed. And I think that's where now it gets interesting for us and for our situation where we are right now. After trying all these things, after all this excommunication and all this extermination, the powers that be in Paris turn to reconciliation. Offer them conciliation, seduce them, bring the Vendée back under control. This isn't working. Excommunication is not working. None of this is working. As a matter of fact, it's making things worse. So now it's time for the seduction. As this is happening, of course, the Vendée generals are now fighting a guerrilla warfare. So they're able to move in and out, and there's all sorts of military successes that are still studied to this day. These brilliant generals, these Catholic generals, were able to pull off while this strategizing is going on in Paris. So Paris realized they have to do something. So they offer amnesty to all who would lay down their arms. 900 prisoners are freed at Nantes. Republican delegates are assured the Vendéan generals that all they have to do, here's a quote, "all you have to do is recognize the Republic and everything will be arranged." Does it sound familiar? All you have to do is accept Vatican II and everything will be arranged. Say the new Mass once. You don't have to say it all the time, just say it once. It's the same tactic. Charette was told the exact same thing. Monsieur Charette is told the same thing. Listen to this, quote, "The kings of Europe," they say, "and now have recognized our republic. Why won't you? Charette's answer is beautiful. He says, "That may be true, but they are not Catholic Vendéans." Just, right straight in their face. So obviously this is a problem. Mr. Charette is a big problem because he's dynamic, he's dashing, he's brilliant, he's Catholic, he's got it all, and people will die for him. And his message, like Thomas More's, is screaming up and down Europe now. This is not a peaceful thing. The people are objecting, they are resisting, thanks to these leaders, especially Charette. The message is getting out, the revolution is failing, and they're panicking. So the serious negotiation then steps up. They ratchet it up in 1795, making concession after concession again. Complete freedom now, complete freedom of religion and worship is granted to the Vendéans. Non-juring priests will not be molested in any way. Confiscated property will be returned. These are the promises. A huge indemnity will be paid by the Republican government. Order will be maintained not by the terror, the blues, les bleus, but by Vendéan guards themselves. They can't turn it down. It's a great deal. Everything is being offered to them. So in February of 1795, even General Charette himself, for a short period, accepts, and he accepts the bargain, he takes the deal. He enters Nantes in triumph, and there's great celebrations. The war is over. All these beautiful priests and nuns who somehow managed to keep their lives come out of hiding. They say Mass in public. The old Mass is back. It's wonderful. There's joy and jubilation. The war is over, or so they thought. But of course, it was a trap. The Republican government, the Masonic-inspired government, had counted on the Catholicity of the Vendéans, knowing they were not a warring people. They had given them the taste of peace and freedom, and they assumed that the Vendéans would accept that and never want to go back into the bloody battlefield, never want to take up arms again. But again, they underestimated the faith of these people. It was all about their religion, their Mass, and their priests. And it was not just about their freedom, but it was about the rights of the church. It was about the rights of God. France was the eldest daughter of the church, and they were insulted, the Vendéans were, by the notion that they could be placated by promises of mere freedom to worship. It was more than that. Their country was Catholic, and they were fighting for the restoration of Catholicism in France. And the revolution couldn't get that, just couldn't grasp it. So they turn against their great concession too quickly, and the Vendéans see it. The conscription begins again, and they begin all the promises of lowering taxation, and the indemnities aren't paid, and so forth. But still, at this point, this idea of divide and conquer is still quite effective. So there's this huge period now of confusion. Is the revolution going to give us more? Is this just a transition period where we're going to kind of get used to coexistence, or what's happening? There's all this discussion going on, sort of like there is now. Charette was not fooled. When he sees what's happening, he says, this is it, we're going back to the battlefield, we're taking up the sword again. And so he puts out a general call for the Vendéans to meet with him on June 24th, and 4,000 men answer the call. And this is what he said. He said, "We have taken up arms again, and we will not put them down until the rightful King of France has been placed upon the throne of his fathers, and the Catholic religion has been fully restored and faithfully preserved in France." The peasants cry, "Vive la France, vive Charette." Gentlemen, the war begins again. But the allure of the Republican promises is still too strong. And Charette begins to lose his most loyal troops and his most loyal allies as he continues in his guerrilla warfare. His greatest blow, however, comes when the non-juring priests turn on him. Now, it's important to state this right. They don't turn on him. They believe that it's time that the time for peace has come. And so they had been so faithful, these traditional Catholic priests, so faithful, they now say to Charette, we can't fight forever. Eventually we have to come out of the hills. Now is the time. And so they're encouraging the people now to accept the promises of Paris and to accept peace. And it worked. It worked. They even had bishops in exile now who are advising them, just as what happened with the Cristeros and Pius XI, you have hierarchical figures now telling the peasants that the uprising was over and it's time to sue for peace. And as I say, the Republican General Hoche's plan worked to perfection. He used the sensus catholicus of the Catholic Vendéans to his own advantage. He knew the power of the priests. He knew what would happen when those traditional priests would say, it's time to lay the swords down. he knew it would work because they're Catholics and they listen to their priests, and that's exactly what happened. And he explains this in a letter to his officers. He says, quote, "As priests, their nature is naturally inclined towards peace. With a little tact, we can use them as a means of pacifying the region. Send officers and soldiers to assist at their masses. When you meet the peasants, speak to them reverently about God." Republican officers obeyed General Hoche's command and even went about helping the non-juring priests rebuild the churches and sanctuaries they themselves had sacked. Michael Davies, in his book, talks about the paradox. He says, quote, "The very soldiers who had been torturing priests and profaning tabernacles a few months before were now behaving as if they were faithful Catholics again. But the tactic worked. The non-juring priests continued to refuse to take the oath of loyalty to the Republic, but they no longer preached against it." Again, it sounds familiar. This idea that we're no longer to criticize the revolution of Vatican II in exchange for our right to practice our traditional faith, to have the traditional Mass. Stop criticizing the revolution. Stop criticizing the new Mass. Stop criticizing these things, and everything will be peaceful again. Same tactic was used here, only by a government against the Catholics in the Vendée. And this revolution, another interesting point, they sold this idea of a change of heart so effectively that they began to sort of frustrate their own men, which we see happening today. So their own generals were saying, "What is going on?" They're looking back at Paris and saying, "I can't believe you're giving these Vendéens so much when it comes to the faith." General Clark actually says, he says, "Our revolution, so far as religion is concerned, has proved a complete failure. France has become once more Roman Catholic." And he laments this, of course. What he doesn't realize is that there's a plan, there's a contingency plan for this apparent change of heart coming from Paris. And it's very similar to what we're seeing today. Is there a true change of heart? We're reading on the New York Times, front page of the New York Times and the Washington Post all the time. Traditional Catholicism is winning. You know, the old Mass is back. The Vatican II is over. And everyone's struggling with, is this accurate? Is it true? Or is it another tactic? And this is what we're trying to figure out every day. Is it a tactic, or is it, in fact, the reality? And wouldn't we all love to know? It's very difficult to say. Because there are good men there were good men, even a man like Hoche was actually a good man. He believed that peace should come. He wanted the Vendéens to have peace. And so he has this process by which he kind of fools them and cajoles them into compliance. But it's for the good of France, so he thinks. It's the same today. For the good of the church, let's end the schisms. Let's have unity. So everyone, again, is pretty much seduced by this plan, then, of reconciliation, except for Charette. The old soldier had fought them too often. He had looked into their eyes. He knew that he could not make a deal with them. Reconciliation was not possible. And for reasons which are later described by historian Daniel Ropes, who says, in the Vendée, quote, "determined atheists who availed themselves of every opportunity to conduct operations whose purpose was nothing less than the suppression of all belief. It was not only against the Catholic Church that the revolution directed its attack, but against the faith and against God himself." This is what Charette knew. This is what all the Vendéens knew. But gradually, it was boiled down to only a few who would continue to fight to the very, very bitter end. Charette would not lay down his arms, no matter what, until, as he put it, the King of France was restored and the Catholic religion was given not just freedom, but pride of place as the only religion in France. Is this fanatical? Is it intransigent? Isn't it basically what we're saying? We have the Mass, and yet we realize that a fight must go on still until the kingship of Christ is restored, until our religion is recognized for what it is, the only means of salvation instituted by Christ himself. We're not looking for a place among the great pantheon of the world's religions. We're not looking for just freedom to practice our religion. Of course, we want the freedom, and we hope we have it. But when it comes to it, we also have to defend the fact that there is only one true church, and it's the Catholic Church. So we get to this point where Charette is speaking this sort of language, and it's obvious to everyone that he is not going to surrender. And so the Republican General Hoche says, one way or another, we've got to stop this man. It's the same situation. We have to either sue for appeasement, or we have to kill him. And Hoche's strategy of reconciliation, again, with Charette's own men, is working. By 1796, there's only a tiny remnant left of the once great royal and Catholic army. And Charette tries again. He says, "Surrender your arms. Hoche, surrender your arms, rebuild your homes, cultivate your farms, pray to God. You will be left alone. End this terrible schism in our country. But again, it's the non-juring priests that finish the job, the ones that come in and say to Charette, it's time to lay down your arms. So a good number of Charette's soldiers by this point are now listening, and it's pretty much obvious that the war in the Vendée is nearing its conclusion. So on November 25th, 1795, some of Charette's own officers bring him a document, which is a list of suggestions that they felt could constitute a basis for a settlement. We might call it a preamble. When they had finished, Charette reads it, he looks at it and he says, "Is that all?" And they said, "Yes." And he says, "Throw it in the fire and burn it." And at that point, everyone, of course, realizes there's no way out of this. We are going to die for this cause. And so the resistance dwindles to just a few hundred. They go into the swamps. They go into serious hiding and guerrilla warfare wherever they can. And Hoche again has the audacity. You sense a certain respect that he has for Charette, but again he has the audacity to try one more time. He says, "If you will leave the Vendée, I will let you live." He sends this message, last minute message, "Just leave, and I'll let you live." Charette's answer again is classic. He says, "I shall conquer or die for my God and my King. That is my resolve, and it will never change." Furious, General Hoche issues an order to his men. Give him no rest. Force him to retreat. Kill him. Use any form of deceit, but stop General Charette. Obviously losing his temper. He's so angry over the fact that this Catholic heart would refuse to cease its campaign for the church. So Michael Davies, I'll just read his last moments, or his capture is interesting. He says, for Altar and Throne, he says, on March 23rd, Charette and his remaining handful of followers were hemmed in by 3 of the columns that Hoche had put in play. But Charette would still not surrender. They fought throughout the day, their numbers dwindling as the Blues picked them off one by one. Charette's faithful bodyguard, Pfeiffer, received a fatal wound, and as he died, he cries out, "Here I am, it is I, Charette." But the Blues were not deceived, and the pursuit intensified. Charette was completely trapped in a forest. Again and again, he tried to find his way out. It wasn't guarded, but to no avail. The Blues came upon him at last, opened fire. A musket ball lodged in his shoulder, and he continued to fight. A Blue officer slashed at him with his sword and cut 3 fingers from his left hand. "Where is Charette?" the officer demanded. "He is here," was the reply, and Charette was arrested on the spot. And he's brought to a place called La Chaboterie, which is kind of interesting. La Chaboterie is a place you can visit to this day. He's brought there, he's laid on a table, and he's patched up in order for them to execute them. They wanted to fix him a little bit. And the table where they laid him is actually you can still visit it. In this book, which is written by Michael Davies for Altar and Throne, this was presented at a lecture at La Chaboterie in 1995, right where they had brought Charette. So this whole project and this whole awakening of American Catholics to this crusade in France began right at the place where Charette was dying, the great leader, the king of the Vendée. It's kind of an interesting coincidence, maybe not, but that's how it worked out. So Charette is then brought to Nantes. There's a show trial, the usual show trial. He's paraded through the streets, because they wanted everyone to know that finally they had conquered this last bit of Catholic resistance. He asks if he could have a non-juring priest hear his confession. That request is denied. So he accepts the juring priest, which is Marie Antoinette did not. When Marie Antoinette went to her death, she refused to confess herself to one of the traitor priests. Charette, being a man of the world, says, "I'm not going to take my chances. I'm going to confess. So let me have this guy. I'll see what happens." So he talks to him for 2 hours, and he has a confession. But his men managed to work out a rendezvous place where Charette would be allowed to walk past a non-juring priest. So there's this beautiful story where, as he's being led then through the streets to his execution, suddenly a window opens, and there's one of his stalwart priests, his traditional Catholic priest, is standing at the window, and Charette just stops for a moment and bows his head, and there's an absolution. So he hedges his bet. He gets absolution from both the juring and the non-juring. And we've all been through that, I think, haven't we? So his death is actually worth relating because it's just so amazing. His confessor goes all the way with him to the place of execution, and when he arrives at the place of execution, he embraces his confessor. He audibly and loudly prays his act of contrition as he's getting ready to die. He refuses the blindfold. And he asks his last request, may I be the one to tell the men to shoot. He wants to be the one to give the signal when it is time. So he stands at attention, his head held high, and he points to his chest and he shouts out to the firing squad, soldiers, aim here. It is here that you must strike the heart of a brave Catholic. Vive le roi! And he lowers his head dramatically. 5 musket balls are fired through the air, tear his chest. He stays standing for a few moments and slumps to the ground. The king of the Vendée, the leader of the traditional Catholic resistance against the French Revolution, was dead, and he was 33 years old. His fight, if you remember one thing about this presentation of mine, is that his fight was not for religious freedom. He was given his religious freedom. They were begging him to take his religious freedom. And again and again and again, he refused it. It was not about his personal preferences or his liturgical preferences. It was about what he had to do, his duty as a Roman Catholic, to preserve the Catholic faith, not the freedom of religion of everyone else, but the Catholic faith when it was under bloody attack. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we have to do the same today. The debate goes on over the mandate of Obama. I'm glad to see the American bishops have finally stirred themselves. But is it truly about religious freedom at this point? I don't think it is. It's not about our rights. It's not about our peace. It's not, again, as we heard in the previous talk, it's not just about the rights of man. That's a Freemasonic idea, in a way. It's about the rights of God that have been completely ignored. So, to close, we have this idea of not trying to sound, too overly dramatic, but the idea of letting the question of martyrdom finally enter the discussion becomes very important in little groups like this. Not that any one of us thinks he's capable, has the grace or the strength to be a martyr. If you think that, you've got a problem. But we have to discuss whether or not that is to be an option very soon, whether we have the strength to do it, whether we're praying enough, if we're asked to do it. I don't want to be a martyr if I don't have to be. And if it comes to it, and I think I'm the only one that's going to die, let's just say, me for a moment, the weakest and most sinful in the room, but if I think to myself, I'm the only one that's going to die for this crazy nut black helicopter cause, and all of you guys are going to run, you're going to go for the high grass and not die for it, tell you what, I'm with you. I'm going to chase after you. So the idea of forming a consensus now on what we're going to do. Yes, vote for a marriage amendment and to change or to solidify the definition of marriage. Sure, do all those things. But also begin to solidify, to come up with an argument or come up with an agreement, a contract, if you will, that we will do our best to take this all the way, just like Charette did, just like Thomas More did. These men that didn't want to die, didn't want to be martyrs, but ultimately did, and changed history, changed the world for having done so. And so I'm going to conclude with a quote, because I don't want to conclude on a dark note. I want to give you a beautiful little passage from a French thinker. He died just a few years ago. His name is Jean Husset, and he is another son of the Vendée. He was a proponent of the Vendée. And he talks about this idea, if we are called to martyrdom, as were the great saints, it's not the end of the world. Everyone in this room, except for the young ones, will be dead in 50 years. I certainly will be, much longer than that. We're all going to die. The idea of saying we may die for a cause and go down like Charette did, say, shoot here, this is where you kill a Catholic, shouldn't be such an abhorrent thought to us. It might be kind of a wonderful thought in a way. That's how we're going to meet our Maker? Not bad. Maybe we can do it. And Jean Husset says, yes, of course, that's where your peace, that's where your happiness, that's where the positive conclusion to all this comes in. Recognize where we stand. It's a glorious moment. It's not the end, it's the beginning. These aren't my words, these are his, and I really want to just conclude with this. It is so beautiful. And this was just written 10, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. He says, quote, "It is the night. Let us stand fast and fight. Happy are those who, like the young she-goat, are determined to fight to the death, who refuse to lie down and die before the break of day. For it is by enduring until the dawn that true victory is won, that our task is accomplished. And even if the wolves withdraw only after they have torn us to pieces, The dawn is, in fact, the time when the wolves flee the light, the time when they take flight from the flock, the time when even the cowardly take heart, the time when the flock can advance without fear." End quote. We must pray, all of us, for each other, that we can become the true soldiers of Christ, that we may be asked to be very soon, the martyrs that we may be asked of us. And when the time comes for us to lie down and die, may we see in the east that brilliant light, not of a star, but of the lumen gentium, of the Sol Justitiae, which is the Christ, the dawn of a new Christian order in the world. May we never, ever lose hope of that reality, and may we never, ever stop striving to make it the reality. Thanks for listening, and long live Christ the King, obviously.
Oh, happy is he that from business free can enjoy his mistress' bottle and his friend.
The Blessed Virgin gave us a message how to have world peace, that only she can help us. But perhaps we don't get enough perspective. We say, well, nothing dramatic has happened. And it's because our commentators, our newspapers, our editor writers, the people that we really pay attention to, the people that speak on television, in the mainstream press and so forth, people who are under the pay of the enemy often, have yet to point out to us that since we have despised Our Lady's message as the human family, we've despised it, there have been 1,686,570,000 violent deaths as a direct result of ignoring Our Lady of Fatima. That is, again, 1 billion. That is 1 with 9 zeros after it, plus another 686 million people who have died violently for the one simple reason that we've ignored Our Lady of Fatima. We could point out, perhaps another time, that if this is not enough perspective to give us that in these 95 years of ignoring Our Lady of Fatima, we have paid a tremendous price. But as bad as that is, that price will be doubled or tripled in the next couple of years if we ignore her much longer. Just a few months ago, the world's population passed 7 billion people. 7 billion people. Scripture tells us, and other prophecies tell us, that 1/3 to 2/3 of the entire population of mankind will be wiped out in this war to come. I don't know what it takes to wake us up. Maybe we have to find it on NBC or CBS or some commentator in the New York Times before we finally take this seriously. And maybe we say to ourselves, we take it seriously, but I think we don't take it seriously enough. We have many priorities. Sometimes I wonder how I get through my day between what I'm supposed to do today, between getting up and doing my reading, doing my other work, talking to people that God wants me to talk to and so forth. And we only all have 24 hours a day. And I'm sure that my life is not as busy as the bishops and the Pope. But we must make this priority number one. There is nothing more serious, nothing more important, nothing more urgent than Our Lady's message at Fatima. And this is something that I don't know how to say. I remember getting a letter from an older bishop many years ago. I think he was in Ottawa. And he said to me basically in his letter, "Father Gruner, if you would not raise your voice so much, if you would not yell at us, we might start paying attention to you." And I wrote back to him and I said, "I appreciate very much your interest, and your concern and your advice. Now, if you can tell me how I can do that any better than what I'm doing and get the attention, I'd be very happy to do it. I hate yelling at people. I hate raising my voice, and I hate trying to draw attention to myself. But there's no other way around on this message. If there's something more important, and certainly yesterday we were in this March for Life here in Rome, and the number of people that are killed by abortion since about 1975, by the statistics we looked up, is about 1,300,000 people. And by war, there's another 78 million people. And then by government murder, not only in Russia and China, but other parts of the world, 238 million people. These are catastrophic, and they lead us to think that we are, as Pope Pius X, St. Pius X said, that we are in the days just before the coming of the Antichrist. These things that are happening to us, which Pope Benedict, when he was Cardinal Ratzinger, said, that refer to this Fatima message is found in sacred scripture, that we are living the times of the apocalypse. And although we can be distracted with everything from daily newspapers to new movies or whatever else it is that entertains us, these things are happening around us, and they're happening every day. And they're happening in such a way that how can we deny that we're living in, if it's not the apocalypse, if it is not the time coming before the Antichrist, it is the best, shall we say, preview or event which the world has never seen before. Just looking at the Catholic Church, for example, the only other time in church history that comes close to this time is the Arian crisis, when 90% of the bishops were Arian. And there was only about 3 or 4 bishops who actually stood up, and the greatest of them all, St. Athanase, was actually excommunicated by the Pope in 357 AD. Now, he wasn't really excommunicated because, as the Church has always recognized, as St. Thomas points out, that law is not something that just the legislator says. Law is the ordination of reason. It is for the common good. And as the Church law to this day points out, that no one can be punished if he doesn't commit a crime. So because Athanasius was standing up for the faith, because he was defending the faith, which was his duty to do, he could not be punished even if the Pope pronounced a sentence of excommunication. In fact, Liberius regretted his action, but Liberius is the first pope not to be canonized from the time of St. Peter to the year 357. It's well for us to remember then that we need not be afraid of the judgments of men if we are on the right side of God. It's a principle that we need to keep in mind. We also have to understand that prophecy is a function in the church. It's a function that will never go away. It's a function that must be respected, just as the apostolic offices must be respected. As St. Paul tells us in Ephesians, the church is built upon the foundation of the apostles and the prophets, not just the apostles. The role of prophecy is essential. Scripture tells us that we must not extinguish the Spirit. We must not despise prophecy, but we must test all things and hold fast that which is good. So that is why I've promoted the message of Fatima, not only because it's unique among all the messages, but of course it's been approved by the Church. As Father Joseph St. Marie pointed out here in Rome, he's the one who wrote the speech for the Pope in 1982 when he went to Fatima. Father Joseph St. Marie points out that it is the role of the hierarchy to judge, to test whether the prophet speaks the truth. But once the hierarchy recognizes that the message comes from God, then the Pope himself and the bishops are bound to obey, not the prophet, but God who speaks through the prophet to them. That obligation is primordial. that is not for us to say, I'm telling the Pope what to do. No, but Our Lady of Fatima is telling him what to do. All I do is explain what it means. I answer the objections of theologians or others who haven't had the time to think about it. So when we get back to 1917, Our Lady comes. She comes and gives a message to show mankind the way to peace. She was asked, she was insisted that she come. She comes and she explains. And then for the next 95 years, we basically ignore her. So our Lord himself, in 1931, explained to the Pope and the bishops something, a lesson from history. He said, make it known to my ministers, given they follow the example of the King of France, in delaying the execution of my command, like the King of France, they will follow him into misfortune. What is that example he's talking about, the King of France? On the 17th of June, to the very day, the 17th of June, 1689, our Lord spoke to St. Margaret Mary and told her to tell the King of France to consecrate France to the Sacred Heart. Now the kings of France, there were 3 of them from that day, all ignored St. Margaret Mary's prophecy and our Lord's command through St. Margaret Mary. Even during her lifetime, St. Margaret Mary was known as a saint. She was well hidden, but her reputation for sanctity was well known among her contemporaries. And so, for them to ignore this, they paid with their lives. On the 17th of June, 1789, that's 100 years later to the day, the King of France was stripped of his authority by the Third Estate. 3 weeks later, the French Revolution, the storming of the Bastille. On the 20th or 21st of January, 1994, his head was cut off by the soldiers of the Revolution. And our Lord makes reference to this and says, make it known to my ministers, given they follow the example of the King of France, in delaying the execution of my command, like him, they will follow him into misfortune. Up until now, basically, the popes and the bishops around him have ignored, have delayed, have had one excuse after another. I think I've heard them all. And as we've had proven at these conferences before, none of those excuses really hold water. There is really no excuse for not doing it. However, that is not their choice up to now.